Good morning, friends. Welcome to the Immanuel 10 at 10. Looks like it's going to be another blue sky, hot day, but there's a chance of some rain in the forecast. So I certainly hope that we're able to, and pray that we're able to get some. Our crops and our lawns are desperate for rain. Well, this week in our uh, 1-year chronological Bible reading plan, we have been reading through, um, continued through the books of Kings and Chronicles, and we've what's happened is there's been a civil war in Israel after Solomon, King Solomon, his son Rehoboam took over. Rehoboam ended up causing this civil war by not listening to his older advisors. He that when Jeroboam was anointed as Rehoboam was anointed as king, he had the people of northern Israel come down and ask him to please be to lighten the burden that Solomon had laid on them. Solomon had the northern tribes build the kingdom, different cities, the walls of Jerusalem, and the temple and the palace. And he'd made life very difficult for them. And so they were asking, would you please lighten the burden that we've experienced? And Solomon told them that, or Rehoboam rather, told them instead that rather than listening to his wise old advisors who told him to go along with the people's requests and make things easier for them, instead he listens to the advice of his younger advisors who were his friends that he'd grown up with. They told him, you should really put them in their place. Tell them that you're stronger than your father, so you're going to make things even worse for them. Well, naturally, the northern tribes didn't like that idea, and so they broke away and formed from Judah and formed their own country of Israel in the north. And for their king, they brought back Jeroboam, who was kind of a rebel leader who had fled to Egypt after a prophet had promised that he would be given 10 tribes because of Solomon's sin. So then, the kings that came after them, both in Israel and in Judah, the southern kingdom, got gradually worse and worse, especially in Israel. The worst of the Israelite kings was Ahab, who married this Sidonian princess named Jezebel. And Jezebel turned him away from God to worship her god, Baal. And so a prophet, Elijah, stepped forward and said, what you are doing is not good. And God is going to tear the kingdom away from you. He said, by my word, there will be no rain here in Israel for the next few years until I say so. Now, usually a prophet hears a word from God and then speaks that word. Here, Elijah seemed to just kind of do that on his own. And uh, then God's word came to him and said, you better run and hide. And so he ran and hid in a ravine that went dry because of the drought. And eventually, God told him, all right, now leave the ravine and go to a town in Sidon called Zarephath. And I've told a widow there to take care of you. And so, as Elijah was walking into town, he saw this widow at the gate gathering some sticks, and he asked her to bring him some water and a little piece of bread. And her face looked downcast, and she said, I've only got a tiny little bit of oil and flour left, and I'm just gathering sticks to make a little fire make a to bake a small cake over it. And that will be the last food that my son and I can eat, and then we're going to die of starvation because of this famine. But Elijah promised that God would make sure that the oil and the water did not run out until God sent rain on the land. Sure enough, that's what happened. For many, many days afterwards, she kept making more cakes out of the oil and the flour, and there was always more. Eventually, her son died, and she was lamenting over him. And Elijah said, God, please restore him. He prayed for the boy, and the boy came back to life. Well, then later on, Elijah had a contest with the prophets of Baal, a confrontation right on Mount Carmel, which was where the prophets of Baal worshiped Baal. All the people of Israel gathered there at Mount Carmel, and Elijah said to them, when are you going to stop dancing between two different opinions? If God, the Lord is God, then worship him and serve him. But if Baal is God, then serve him. And so he proposed this contest where they would each offer a sacrifice, build an altar and lay wood on it and a bull, but not put fire to it. And then each of them would pray to their God, and whoever God answered with fire would be acknowledged as the true God. So the prophets of Baal, 450 of them, went first. They built an altar, they put the wood on it, they sacrificed a bull, and then they prayed and they shouted and they danced, and there was no answer. Around noon, uh, Elijah heckled them and said, hey, maybe Baal's just, relieving himself or asleep, and you just need to shout louder. And so they did. They shouted louder and they danced some more, and they even slashed themselves with swords and spears like they often did to try and get their God's attention. But there was no answer. And then it was Elijah's turn. He gathered 12 stones to represent the 12 united tribes of Israel, built an altar. He laid wood on it, slaughtered a bull and put it on it. And then he said, let's pour some water over this. Bring me 4 jugs of water, huge jugs. Well, they had to go all the way down the mountain to get it and bring it all the way back up. He said, now do it again. They went all the way down, brought it 4 more jugs. Do it again. They went and brought 4 more jugs, poured it all over the altar, the sacrifice, the wood. The water even filled a trench that he dug all the way around the altar. After 12 giant jugs of water, then Elijah prayed, God, show them who you are, that you are the true God. And God poured down fire from heaven that burned up the wood and the sacrifice and licked up all the water in the trench and even consumed the stones of the altar. It was a tremendous triumph. All the prophets of Baal were slaughtered, and afterwards, God sent rain on the land. But when Jezebel heard that her prophets had been slaughtered, she was furious. She sent a message to Elijah saying, may the gods do the same thing to me if by tomorrow I don't make you like one of those prophets. And Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. An angel met him on the way and provided food and water for him so that would be sustained. And he was sustained by the power of that food for 40 days, traveling out into the wilderness. Doesn't that sound familiar? He ended up at Mount Sinai. And there on top of the mountain, God appeared. He sent a great wind that was shattering the rocks. He sent an enormous earthquake that shook the mountain and a fire that blazed on the mountain. But God was not in the wind or the earthquake or the fire. Elijah was hiding in a cave, probably the same cave that Moses had hid in. And then, after the earthquake, wind, and fire, came the sound of, some translations say, a gentle whisper, but the original Hebrew says the sound of crushed silence. And Elijah knew that God was speaking and came out of the cave and wrapped himself in his cloak. Sometimes God speaks to us in silence. And God said to Elijah, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Same question that he'd asked when Elijah first got to Mount Sinai. And Elijah gave the same response. "I have been so jealous for the Lord Almighty, but the Israelites have fallen away and they've rejected you and they have killed all the prophets and I'm the only one left." And God said to Elijah, "All right then, go on your way. You're a washed up prophet. But I still have something for you to do. I want you to anoint new kings over 2 other countries. And I want you to anoint Elisha as the prophet to succeed you." So Elijah left. He didn't go and anoint those other kings, but he did anoint Elisha, although it was somewhat reluctantly. Afterwards, he said, "What have I done to you?" We'll hear more about Elisha next week as we hear the story of how he took on Elijah's mantle. In the description of today's post, I'm including a link to a video on that, an overview of 1st and 2nd Kings that talks about Elijah and Elisha. I'm also including another link to the book of Job. We read that a while back in this one-year chronological Bible reading plan. We don't exactly know when Job was written, but it likely was earlier in the story. But Job is one of the 3 wisdom books. Over the last 2 weeks, we've looked at the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes, which give different perspectives on the good life, on how to live in God's good world. Proverbs is all about, kind of from the perspective of a young teacher who has all these great ideas about and advice for living. Basically focused on the idea of, if you follow God and do what's right, things will go well for you. Ecclesiastes, which we heard last week, is the more cynical take. Kind of a middle-aged guy who sees that that following God's commands doesn't always mean that life goes well. So often things seem to just be by chance, or and life is so mysterious and hard to hold on to. It's like smoke or cloud or vapor. But the 3rd book, Job, is from the perspective of an old man who has seen a lot of suffering in his life. And so this video and study that goes with it focuses on how God responds to Job's suffering. We really need all 3 of these wisdom books for us to really understand and have a good, well-rounded perspective on what God intends for our lives. Well, I hope you have a great weekend. Uh, Worship this weekend is at 9:30, and next weekend, um, the 20th, will be a recap of Vacation Bible School, which is happening on June 14th and 15th, this coming Monday and Tuesday. So sign up your kids or grandkids if you haven't already. And then on the 20th, Pastor Allison is going to be giving a talk on all the themes that they've covered in the uh, Vacation Bible School. Have a great week and see you soon.